What lens do you need for portraits? Look at the number in millimeters on this lens. There are 3 different kinds of lenses and reasons to use them one over the other, so stick around to find out which one is best for you. Most photographers will choose to use prime lenses for their portraits, but today we're using the Sony FX30 with the Sony 16-55mm f2.8 lens. You see, the usual go-to focal lengths or lenses to use for portraits are 35mm, 50mm, and 85mm when it comes to full-frame lenses. But for APS-C, it's 24mm, 35mm, and 50mm. So I'm going to show you the 3 different focal lengths in this one zoom lens and show you the advantages, disadvantages, and the differences overall, and see which one is actually best for you. Without further ado, so first things first, we're going to dial in our focal length at 24mm or 35mm in a full frame setting. So typically at this focal length, we can expect that our subject is going to be having a lot of environment in the frame. And the one thing that you want to keep note of when shooting at this focal length is that you don't want to get too close. Otherwise, you'll start to notice that your subject starts to look a little bit wider than you would like them to be, as there's a natural distortion in the lens when using this focal length. So typically, this is not the most flattering look that you would like to give your model. If I'm using this focal length, typically I want to be farther back or keep them probably the smallest part of the frame and be able to admire the scenery. All right, so we got our subject here, a lot of the environment going on. Okay, so going back to distortion, the higher the number, the less distortion there actually is. So let's move up to 35mm or 50mm for full frame. So again, with a higher number using 35mm, we can notice that there's less of the background here and more of the subject. And if we wanted more background, we could actually move back more, similar to that of the 24mm. Slight smile. But typically this is my favorite focal length and I'd like to punch in a little bit more. Look down at your hands. Just like that. Beautiful. 1, 2, 3. With the higher number, we're getting less distortion in the face and it's going to be a little more pleasing. But to go a step further, we're going to step it up to 55mm here on this lens, all the way zoomed in, or 85mm if you're using that lens for full frame. So I'm kind of standing at the same place that I was before when shooting with the other lens, but as you can see, there's less of the environment and more of the subject. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Again, less of the background, kind of staying a little bit farther from my subject. Getting a lot of bokeh, probably obliterating the background right now. Don't need to smile. So although the 55mm gives you the most flattering look when shooting your portraits, it probably might not be the best case scenario for you, and you don't have a lot of space. See, I had to stand back a little farther from my subject, but if you're shooting indoors and your studio space or whatever space that you have is limited, you might want to knock it down. You might want to go to a 35mm or 24mm in APS-C, or use a 35mm or 50mm when using full frame. But typically most people will want to shoot at 35mm or 24mm as their first lens when using APS-C bodies, or 35mm or 50mm when using full frame. However, when it comes to street photography, you would be more in favor of using the 55mm, as you can get your subjects away and you probably don't interrupt them in their natural habitat. Or maybe 35mm. However, you could always make your subject stand out even more, make your bokeh even creamier, and be able to zoom in from 70 to 200mm. But you have to use one of those big white zoom lenses. Not necessary, but you could do it. I even tried it with a 100 to 400mm lens. If you're just as ambitious to see what that looks like, click this video over here and just check it out. It may not be too crazy and extreme as you might think it is. Thanks again for watching. Now go out there and shoot for the life that matters. Ooh. See ya.